brittle crusts, punctured here and there by the skeletal frames of houses that once hummed with laughter. In the distance, the imperial palace loomed like a memory, its mows reflecting a sky that carried no hint of celebration. On this day, less than 2 weeks after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast had surrendered the nation, the first American boots touched down in the capital. For many Japanese civilians, the arrival was expected to be the prelude to humiliation, violence, or perhaps something even worse. After all, for years, children had been told bedtime stories not of gentle spirits, but of Americans who would slaughter them without mercy. Yet, as the jeeps rolled forward in the smoke-stained air, the first sight was not of devils, but of sunburned men sweating in khaki uniforms, fanning themselves awkwardly with their helmets, their pockets crammed with objects that glimmered like treasure: chocolate bars, tins of Spam, packs of chewing gum. The shock began quietly, almost invisibly. Children were the first to notice. Barefoot, hollow-eyed, some wearing rags cut from old futons. They watched from alleys where the wind blew dust into their hair. Their mothers tugged them back, fearful. Old men muttered under their breath about disgrace, about the shame of seeing enemy soldiers march unchallenged through the heart of the empire. But hunger overpowered fear, and eyes that had been taught only hatred studied the bulging packs of the Americans with curiosity stronger than suspicion. One boy, his ribs sharp under a thin cotton shirt, dared to whisper to his sister, "Do you think they really eat all that?" The truth was, the civilians expected the worst. Since 1937, Japan's state-controlled media had painted Americans as barbaric beasts. Posters depicted GIs as horned demons with knives between their teeth. Mothers told their children that capture by Americans meant certain death. Even in the final days of the war, rumors spread like wildfire. Americans would poison wells, enslave families, burn every temple and shrine. Yet what rolled in through the city was oddly ordinary. Not demons, not conquerors with flaming torches, but tired young men, some barely older than the children who watched them, carrying rifles slung loosely, exchanging awkward glances at the devastation they saw. One soldier scribbled in his journal that day, "Tokyo looks like moonscape. I thought I'd be hated, maybe killed. Instead, they just stare at us. Kids everywhere. Too many kids too hungry." Hunger was indeed the axis around which this encounter turned. By late 1945, rations had dropped below 1,500 calories per person per day. Rice, the soul of the Japanese meal, was scarce. People scavenged weeds, acorns, even sawdust to stretch their meals. Children collapsed in schools from weakness. Ill nutrition stunted growth. Black markets sprouted like mushrooms in alleys. But only those with connections could trade. For the rest, every day was a negotiation with emptiness. When the Americans appeared, it was as if moving storerooms of abundance had stumbled into the wasteland. And then, the unthinkable happened. Instead of barking orders or seizing property, the young American private, his helmet tilted too big for his head, stopped his jeep, crouched down, and offered a chocolate bar to a little girl who clutched a broken doll. The girl's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had been told these men would kill children first. Instead, she saw her daughter hold the bar like a relic, sniffing the sweet, unfamiliar scent before daring a small bite. Her eyes widened. She had never tasted anything like it. Her giggle, light and nervous, carried across the silent street. That moment spread like wildfire through whispers. American soldiers were giving food, not stealing it, not hoarding it, but pressing cans and bars into the hands of children. Soon, other GIs followed suit. Powdered milk ladled into chipped bowls. Gum unwrapped for small, eager mouths. Spam sliced and passed around, though no one quite knew how to cook it. The air of dread fractured, replaced by stunned disbelief. Mothers wept in silence, torn between gratitude and humiliation. Fathers turned their faces away, ashamed that the survival of their families might now depend on the kindness of enemies. But the children, always the barometers of truth, did not hesitate. They ate. They chewed gum until it stuck to their hair. They licked chocolate off their fingers, wide-eyed at a sweetness they had never known. For them, ideology melted quicker than sugar on the tongue. The soldiers laughed softly, perhaps relieved to discover that feeding children was easier than facing soldiers across a battlefield. And in that fragile laughter, something shifted. Of course, the sight was not universal. In the same city, there were still voices of bitterness. "Shameful," an old man muttered as he saw his neighbor's boy running with a Hershey bar in hand. "We bow to them now, even for food." Yet even he could not ignore the glow on the child's face. Hunger is a ruthless teacher, and it teaches pragmatism faster than pride. For the Americans, the act was partly instinct, partly policy. Official relief efforts under General MacArthur's Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, would take time to organize. Shipments of wheat and powdered milk would not arrive in bulk until months later, but soldiers carried rations, and soldiers noticed children. It was easier to hand out food than to explain occupation. Easier to win a smile than to manage silence. Perhaps, too, it was a way to remind themselves of their own humanity after years of killing. The civilians did not know it yet, but this simple act would ripple outward. What began as scattered gifts of chocolate and gum would evolve into formalized food aid, school lunch programs, and the reshaping of daily Japanese diets. Yet in that moment, no one thought of policy. They thought only of hunger and of the unimaginable. An enemy bending low to feed a child. By dusk that day, word had spread through Tokyo's ruins. The Americans had not come only with guns. They had come with food. Children told other children. Mothers whispered to neighbors. Fear did not vanish, but it cracked, and through that crack seeped something Japan had not felt in months, perhaps in years. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. As the sun sank behind the broken skyline, an American jeep paused near a small shrine that still stood, its roof half-caved from firebombing. A soldier climbed down, a can of milk powder in his hand. Dozens of children surrounded him, their eyes wide, not with terror but with expectation. He smiled, though awkwardly, and held it out. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolled solemn and strange. In that sound was the weight of surrender, the ache of hunger, and the whisper of something almost inconceivable, that an empire brought to its knees might find its first taste of recovery, not in victory or vengeance, but in a spoonful of foreign food. And what those children would soon discover was that this was only the beginning. The taste of chocolate was not just sweetness. For many Japanese children in 1945, it was the first moment they realized life might be different than what they had been told. In the narrow lanes of Osaka, where smoke still drifted from bomb-blackened walls, a small boy named Haruo sat on a step holding a square of Hershey's. He had been taught that Americans were merciless beasts, but the square melted in his mouth with a flavor he could not reconcile with the word enemy. His mother, watching from behind, tightened her hands into fists. Gratitude came with shame, and shame came with survival. In that tension, the entire nation found itself reflected. Food became the battlefield of perception. The Americans, for their part, carried rations filled with curiosities, tinned Spam that shone pink and slick, powdered milk sealed in tins, and chewing gum that confused grandmothers who thought it must be swallowed whole. To starving civilians, these items appeared almost mythical. To soldiers, they were ordinary, even disposable. That disparity of meaning created a quiet theater on Japan's streets, soldiers passing out goods with the casualness of men who had plenty, civilians receiving them with the reverence of those who had nothing. The contrast was most striking in the faces of children. Oral histories tell us of one girl, barely 8, who took a piece of gum from a Marine and held it aloft like a jewel. She chewed until the sweetness faded, then carefully tucked the wad behind her ear to preserve it, returning to it later as though it were gold. Such moments spread in whispers, softening images that propaganda had burned deep. "They are not monsters," one boy muttered to his sister. "Monsters do not give candy." The statistics underline the desperation. By the end of 1945, Japan was importing less than half the food it had before the war. Calorie intake for civilians dipped below subsistence levels. Adults fainted at work. Children's bellies swelled with hunger. Relief shipments under SCAP began to arrive, but distribution took time. In that interim, the sight of GIs handing out personal rations carried weight far heavier than the items themselves. In cities like Yokohama and Nagoya, soup lines appeared where powdered milk was whisked into steaming bowls, poured into hands cupped with chipped porcelain. Some children gagged at the unfamiliar flavor, yet drank anyway, the warmth filling stomachs long accustomed to emptiness, and yet acceptance was complicated. Parents stood at a distance, their faces lined with unease. To take food from the enemy was to admit dependence. One Osaka mother later recalled, "I cried when my son drank the milk. I wanted him to live, but I felt our pride dissolve." Pride was a fragile commodity in those months, and every act of relief threatened to shatter it further. Still, starvation forced choices. Children carried fewer doubts, and in their eagerness, the cracks of reconciliation widened. American soldiers, too, felt the strangeness. One GI interviewed decades later remembered the weight of a boy's eyes as he handed him a can of Spam. "He looked at me like I was giving him the world." Back home, Spam was a joke. But there, it was treasure. I think that's when I realized what we'd done to this country. The irony was sharp. Food mocked as low-ass back in the States became a symbol of mercy in occupied Japan. Humor crept in, despite the gravity. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a grandmother boiled Spam for hours, assuming it was raw pork, and complained that it dissolved into mush. Another family tried to fry powdered milk into patties, only to scrape the burnt mess off their pan with disappointment. Such stories, though small, reveal the awkward merging of two worlds. The gifts were not only nourishment, but cultural encounters. Moments when misunderstanding gave way to laughter or frustration, but always left a trace of human contact. Children's testimonies from those years are vivid. A boy recalled the shock of tasting real sugar for the first time, his tongue aching from the sudden sweetness. A girl remembered clutching her first candy bar, afraid to eat it, afraid it would vanish too quickly. When she finally took a bite, she said it was like eating light. To them, these were not just treats. They were evidence that the enemy carried something other than firebombs. Yet the central conflict remained. How could a nation reconcile images of death with gestures of kindness? Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still wounds so raw that survivors flinched at the sight of any American face. Tokyo's ruins whispered of the March firebombing when over 100,000 people had died in a single night. To take chocolate from the same hands that had dropped napalm was almost unthinkable. And yet it happened. Every bite contained contradiction. Bitterness and sweetness tangled into one. Autumn, the informal handouts began to echo official relief. In schools, teachers lined up children for steaming ladles of soup thickened with U.S. wheat. Laughter crept back into courtyards where silence had reigned. Still, some children remembered the shame more than the taste. One boy recalled hiding his chocolate bar under his shirt so no one would see him eating it. Another said he ate with his back to his mother, too ashamed to let her see his pleasure. For the soldiers, the moments offered relief of another kind or had hardened them, stripped them of innocence. To kneel before children and hand out food was to reclaim something they feared had been lost. One Marine confessed, "I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't just a killer. The chocolate, the milk, the gum. These were symbols not only for the Japanese, but for the Americans themselves, markers of humanity surviving the wreckage of war." Still, The gap between gesture and trust was wide. Many civilians wondered aloud if the gifts were tricks, ways to lull them into complacency before cruelty resumed. Others asked if poison was hidden in the powder. Distrust lingered as deeply rooted as hunger. And yet, as days turned into weeks, the gifts continued, steady and unthreatening, until doubt began to erode. Children who had once flinched at the sight of soldiers now chased their jeeps, waving for candy. Soldiers, once seen as destroyers, became givers of strange delicacies. The paradox was almost too much to comprehend. In the rubble of a war that had shattered families and reduced cities to ash, a square of chocolate or a spoonful of milk became more than food. They became symbols of survival, gestures that forced both sides to see each other differently. The Japanese learned that the enemy had hands that could feed as well as fists that could strike. The Americans discovered that victory did not end with conquest, but with the fragile act of helping the defeated live another day. By the winter of 1945, the whispers had solidified into cautious acknowledgement. The Americans were not only occupiers, they were also strangely feeders. And though the bitterness of loss lingered like smoke, the sweetness of chocolate began to compete with it in memory. But what those families did not yet realize was that these small gifts were only the beginning. Food was about to become a weapon of peace, wielded not on battlefields but in schoolyards and kitchens, reshaping a nation's future, meal by meal. The ruins of Japan were not just physical, they were emotional landscapes, crumbled as thoroughly as the brick and timber of its cities. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Osaka, all bore scars that could not be swept clean in a season. Nearly 9 million people were left homeless in the closing months of 1945, living in makeshift shelters of corrugated tin, tarps, and salvaged boards. Winter bit through walls that did not exist. Children slept with bellies empty, and adults fought off the weakness of malnutrition that dulled both body and spirit. Into this devastation came the occupying force, its uniforms crisp, its jeeps intact, its supplies abundant. The contrast was not lost on anyone. General Douglas MacArthur, the figure who loomed over occupation policy, insisted in his early directives that famine must be prevented at all costs. He understood what his men saw with their own eyes. Starving people could not be governed. "Give them food," he wrote in dispatches, "and we will earn more than obedience. We will earn a chance for peace." His words filtered down into practical acts. American wheat arrived by the ton, milk powder was stacked in warehouses, and plans were made for school lunch programs that could reach millions of children. Relief organizations joined in. CARE, the Red Cross, church missions, all funneling calories into a country where survival had become a daily negotiation. But the grand numbers only tell part of the story. On the ground, the exchanges were deeply human, awkward, and often tinged with pride and shame. A father in Yokohama stood in line at a soup kitchen where American flour had been baked into rough loaves of bread. He tore off a piece for his son, but when the boy asked, "Will you eat too?" the father shook his head and smiled. Later, in an oral history, that boy recalled, "I realized then my father had not eaten for days. Survival was measured not in calories alone, but in sacrifices silently made." The humiliation of dependence weighed heavily. Men who had once marched for the empire now queued behind their children, bowls in hand. One recalled his unease. "I fought against them in the Pacific. Now I take bread from them. It feels like defeat twice over." Pride bent under hunger, yet still resisted breaking. In many neighborhoods, parents forbade children to show too much eagerness when given food, fearing it made them appear beggars. Children obeyed outwardly, but their eyes betrayed them. American soldiers, meanwhile, were caught in their own contradictions. Some had fought in brutal battles, losing friends to Japanese fire. Now they ladled soup or handed out candy to the children of those same enemies. A Marine who had survived Iwo Jima wrote to his wife, "It's the damnedest thing. I thought I'd never look at a kid without hate, but today I gave a little girl a chocolate bar. She bowed. I don't know what to feel anymore. Acts of feeding became a kind of reconciliation, not just for the civilians, but for the occupiers themselves. A chance to reclaim the humanity war had scoured from them. Statistics remain staggering. By 1946, over 870,000 tons of food had been imported to Japan through American aid programs. School lunches, introduced in Tokyo and later spread nationwide, reached millions of children by 1947. These programs provided not only calories but stability, allowing education to resume in buildings that were little more than patched-up ruins. Children who had once fainted in class from hunger now lined up for bowls of stew and bread rolls. For them, food became inseparable from learning, survival entwined with future. Yet even as these gestures soothed, they also deepened contradictions. Civilians remembered the fire bombings that had killed entire neighborhoods. They remembered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where shadows burned into stone, told of lives extinguished in an instant. How could the same hands that dropped fire from the sky now serve bread and milk? The question haunted adults, less so children, but it lingered in every bite. One survivor of the Tokyo firebombing recalled, "When my daughter ate American bread, I felt both relief and anger. They burned my home. Now they feed her, which is their true face." The Americans themselves often stumbled in cultural gaps. Spam baffled households. Wheat felt alien compared to rice, and powdered milk left aftertaste children found strange. Still, hunger made even stranges welcome, and over time adaptations occurred. Wheat turned into noodles, bread into sandwiches, foods that would eventually become staples of a modern Japanese diet. In this way, necessity reshaped culture. Each meal, a quiet negotiation between past identity and present survival. Humor threaded itself into this transformation. In Osaka, children discovered bubble gum and promptly stuck it to their foreheads, assuming it was a decoration. In Tokyo, a grandmother mistook cocoa powder for soil fertilizer and spread it in her garden, later wondering why it smelled so sweet. These small missteps, remembered with laughter years later, softened edges that might otherwise have cut too deep. They revealed that even in ruin, people could stumble into moments of levity, proof that life pressed stubbornly forward. The reconciliation was not instant, not absolute. Distrust persisted, whispered through alleys. They give food today, but what of tomorrow? Yet the consistent presence of meals, the daily repetition of aid, gradually built something sturdier than rumors. Over time, the act of eating foreign food became less an admission of defeat and more a ritual of continuity. Families lived another day. Children grew. Schools hummed with lessons again. And in that rhythm, the image of Americans shifted from conquerors to complicated benefactors. One young man who had been a teenager in 1945 later recalled the transformation. "At first I hated the bread. I hated that it meant we depended on them, but I also hated the hunger more. And slowly I realized I looked forward to it. That confused me. How can you hate and need the same thing?" His words capture the paradox of the moment, the conflict that defined post-war Japan. To despise reliance on the enemy, yet to recognize in their food the possibility of survival and even hope. As the first full winter after surrender settled over the islands, snow blanketed ruins and cold sharpened hunger further. Relief shipments increased, but so did desperation. Fires were stoked in tin shacks. Bowls passed from hand to hand, soldiers and civilians encountering each other across the gulf of language and loss. Each encounter carried more weight than the food itself. It was a test of whether former enemies could inhabit the same fragile present. In the ruins, a new kind of story was taking root, one where meals replaced weapons and school lunches replaced battlefields. Yet the tension remained unresolved, as if every bite carried both gratitude and grief. The Japanese people were learning to see their conquerors as something more complex than demons, and the Americans were learning that peace could not be enforced by rifles alone. But the most powerful shift was yet to come. one that would turn these scattered gestures into something permanent, transforming not only diets but imaginations. For in the years ahead, food would become not just relief, but a foundation for trust, a bridge between conqueror and conquered that neither side had expected. By 1947, the rhythm of relief had become routine. Ships unloaded sacks of wheat and barrels of powdered milk into Japanese ports, and trucks rumbled through shattered neighborhoods, delivering goods that were once unimaginable luxuries. For children who had grown up in hunger, the sound of a ladle striking the bottom of a pot in a schoolyard was as comforting as the ringing of temple bells once had been. They lined up with dented bowls and wooden spoons, their breath clouding in the winter air, their chatter echoing against walls rebuilt from scrap. Each bowl carried more than soup. It carried the promise that tomorrow might look different from yesterday. The school lunch program soon became a lifeline. By 1948, 4 million Japanese children were fed daily through a collaboration of American aid and Japanese organization. Wheat rolls replaced rice balls, milk was poured steaming hot, and dishes flavored with U.S. surplus foods became staples of childhood memory. At first, teachers had to coax children to eat bread, an alien taste in a rice-centered culture. But hunger proved persuasive, and within a few years, children were asking for more. Some would later laugh that their fondness for noodles, curry, and bread, foods now inseparable from Japanese cuisine, had its roots in those post-war meals. Amid these routines, relationships deepened. Civilians who once avoided eye contact with American soldiers began to exchange nods, then words, then cautious laughter. Children followed jeeps not with fear, but with anticipation, waving and shouting for candy. Letters of thanks scrolled in shaky hiragana were delivered to occupation headquarters. One note from a Tokyo boy read simply, "Dear soldier, thank you for bread. I will study hard so I may become strong." The soldier who received it kept it folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. This was not the story either side had expected. Americans had braced for hostility, perhaps even guerrilla resistance. Japanese civilians had braced for cruelty, perhaps even enslavement. Instead, what emerged was something far stranger. Compassion shared across the rubble of war did not erase the trauma of firebombings or the atomic shadows on walls, but it added a new chapter, one where the enemy was no longer only destroyer but also provider. That contradiction became the seed of a fragile trust. Still, trust was never simple. Older generations often resisted it, clinging to grief that would not be softened by bread. Mothers sometimes muttered that food from the enemy was a bitter medicine. Fathers warned their children not to become too fond of the foreigners. But the children themselves were already changing. They laughed as they blew bubbles from chewing gum. They sang songs while clutching loaves of bread. They whispered about soldiers who smiled instead of shouted. For them, America was no longer only fire from the sky. It was also chocolate in the palm of their hands. Humor, unexpected and small, eased the sharp edges. Children described peanut butter as sticky candy paste, baffled by its salty sweetness. Grandmothers tried to serve bread with chopsticks. Soldiers chuckled when they saw children trade candy for marbles, inventing new economies of joy in alleyways. These tiny moments became threads in a fabric of connection, binding two peoples who had once known each other only through violence. The larger transformation was ideological. The American occupation, guided by MacArthur's staff, was not merely military but cultural. Food became its most persuasive weapon, not wielded with force but offered with open hands. Nutrition allowed schools to function, schools allowed ideas to circulate. And slowly, a defeated nation began to rebuild with foundations laid by meals as much as by policies. Japan's post-war democracy, fragile at first, grew sturdier in the soil watered by these daily acts of nourishment. The stomach, after all, is often the most convincing teacher. Personal testimonies reveal the emotional weight of this shift. A woman from Nagoya recalled, "When my son brought home a piece of bread from school, I held it as if it were treasure. It was foreign, strange, and yet it was life. I thought then that maybe we would not vanish." Another from Hiroshima described the irony. The same America that had destroyed my city gave my daughter milk. She drank it every day. She grew tall, taller than I ever thought possible. I could not forgive, but I could not deny the truth of that milk. These voices capture the paradox. Reconciliation born not of forgetting, but of the stubborn insistence of survival. The Americans, too, carried memories of this unlikely exchange. Decades later, veterans of the occupation often spoke not of combat, but of children. One recalled, "I still see their faces when we gave them soup. They bowed so politely, even though they were starving. Broke me more than battle ever did." For soldiers hardened by years of war, handing out food was a way back to their own humanity, as proof that victory did not require cruelty. The result was not instant friendship, but a gradual knitting of lives once torn apart. The act of feeding created shared spaces where language barriers faltered, but smiles prevailed. In the markets rebuilt from rubble, American flour was sold alongside Japanese vegetables. In schools, children recited lessons on democracy between bites of bread. The occupation was still an occupation filled with power imbalances and quiet resentments, but beneath it pulsed the rhythm of meals that could not be ignored, and in this rhythm lay the seeds of something greater. By the early 1950s, as Japan began its climb toward economic revival, memories of hunger receded, but never disappeared. Adults who had once been children of the occupation carried with them the strange, unshakable image of American soldiers handing out food in ruined streets. They remembered chocolate melting in the mouth, gum sticking to their fingers, bowls of milk steaming in winter air. For many, these memories coexisted uneasily with memories of bombings, a contradiction they would wrestle with for the rest of their lives. But contradictions can become bridges. The story of Japan and America after the war is not simple triumph or simple defeat. It is a story of paradox where kindness sprouted from violence and survival was offered by those who had once delivered destruction. It is a story of how children unburdened by the full weight of pride became the first ambassadors of reconciliation. They tasted the food of their conquerors and discovered not demons but men, not myths but human beings. And perhaps that is why the memory endures so powerfully, because it reminds us that even in the darkest aftermath, small acts can shift the course of nations. A spoon of milk, a square of chocolate, a piece of bread. These were not just calories, they were symbols. Quiet proofs that compassion can take root in the most unlikely soil. The occupation years ended, Japan rose from ruin, and the children who once lined up for soup became adults in a prosperous democracy. Yet in countless family stories passed down like heirlooms, the moment remains, the day the enemy gave food to their children. It is remembered not as humiliation, but as the strange, tender beginning of something no one had dared to expect. And if the world has learned anything from that chapter, it is this: that sometimes the most lasting victories are not won with fire or steel, but with kindness measured in spoonfuls,